The studio lights dimmed to their usual warm glow. Johnny Carson sat behind his iconic wooden desk, shuffling through the familiar white cue cards that had guided 30 years of television magic. But tonight something was different. As he lifted one card from the stack, his expression changed. The practiced smile faded. His eyes narrowed, then widened. The entire NBC studio held its breath as America's most beloved host did something he'd never done in 3 decades of broadcasting. He stopped the show. Carson froze mid-monologue. The entire studio went silent. What was written on that card that could stop the most professional man in television? If you want to understand how one piece of paper changed television history forever, subscribe now because this story will leave you speechless. It was April 15, 1987. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was in its 25th year, a television institution as reliable as the sunrise. Carson had delivered over 4,500 monologues, interviewed countless celebrities, and made America laugh through presidencies, wars, and cultural upheavals. But that night, something extraordinary was about to happen. The show began like any other. Doc Severinsen's orchestra played the familiar theme. Ed McMahon delivered his thunderous, "Here's Johnny!" The audience erupted in applause as Carson emerged from behind the iconic curtain, golf swing and all. Everything was perfectly normal until it wasn't. Carson approached his desk with his usual stack of cue cards. These weren't just prompts, they were his lifeline, carefully prepared jokes and transitions that kept the show flowing seamlessly. He'd read thousands of them over the years, each one a small piece of the entertainment puzzle that was The Tonight Show. But as he settled into his chair and began flipping through the cards for his monologue, he paused. One card caught his attention. It wasn't in the familiar handwriting of his writers. The ink looked older, faded. The paper felt different, rougher, like it had been handled many times before. Carson squinted at the card under the studio lights. What he read made his famous composure crack for the first time in decades. The monologue began as usual. Carson delivered his opening jokes with trademark timing. The audience laughed. Doc's band provided perfect musical punctuation. Everything was going according to script until Carson reached for the next card in his stack. That's when he saw it again, the strange card that didn't belong. This time, he couldn't ignore it. Something about the handwriting, the way the words were formed, made him pause. He held the card closer to the light, and as he read the message written there, his entire demeanor shifted. But this was just the beginning. What Carson was about to do next would create the most powerful moment in television history. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The message on the card was simple, written in shaky handwriting. "Mr. Carson, you saved my life tonight. Thank you for making me laugh when I had nothing left. Margaret, 1962. Carson's hands trembled slightly as he read those words. Margaret. 1962. That was 25 years ago, during his second year hosting The Tonight Show. He remembered that night now vaguely. It had been a particularly difficult show. The guests had been boring, the jokes weren't landing, and he'd felt like he was failing America. But someone had been watching. Someone had been saved by his simple act of trying to make people laugh. Carson looked up at the audience, then at the cameras. For a moment, he seemed to forget where he was. The professional mask slipped, and underneath was just a man from Nebraska who'd stumbled into something bigger than himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carson said, his voice softer than usual. "I need to share something with you." The audience sensed the change immediately. The laughter died down. Even Doc Severinsen looked puzzled from his position with the band. Ed McMahon leaned forward in his chair, concerned. Carson held up the weathered cue card. "Sometimes," he continued, "we do things in life without knowing their impact. Tonight, I found a message that's been waiting 25 years to be read." Backstage, producers panicked. This wasn't in the script. Carson never went off book. But he'd made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. He began to read Margaret's message aloud, slowly and carefully. The studio fell completely silent. You could hear the hum of the television cameras, the soft whistle of the air conditioning, the distant traffic outside the NBC building. "Mr. Carson, you saved my life tonight. Thank you for making me laugh when I had nothing left." Carson paused, looking directly into the camera. "Margaret, wherever you are, I want you to know something. You saved mine too." The audience didn't know how to react. This wasn't comedy. This wasn't entertainment in the traditional sense. This was real life happening on television, unscripted and raw. Carson continued, his voice growing stronger. "For 25 years, I've come out here and tried to make people laugh. Some nights are better than others. Some nights I go home thinking I've failed. But Margaret, your note reminds me why we do this." He stood up from behind his desk, still holding the card. "Television isn't just about entertainment. It's about connection. It's about reminding people that they're not alone, especially in their darkest moments." Doc Severinsen, without any cue from Carson or the producers, began playing a soft, gentle melody. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. But somehow, it was perfect. Carson walked to the edge of the stage, closer to his audience. "I don't know how this card ended up in tonight's stack. Maybe it was meant to be found tonight. Maybe Margaret's spirit wanted to remind us all of something important." But this was the moment no one in the studio nor anyone at home ever saw coming. Carson's voice broke slightly as he continued. "We all have the power to save someone's life. Not with grand gestures or heroic acts, but with simple kindness. With a joke when someone needs to laugh. With a smile when someone feels invisible. With the reminder that tomorrow can be better than today." The studio audience began to understand they were witnessing something historic. This wasn't just Johnny Carson the entertainer. This was Johnny Carson the human being, sharing his heart with America. "Margaret, I hope you lived a long and happy life. I hope you found reasons to laugh beyond that night in 1962. And I hope you knew that your thank you note meant everything to a young host who wasn't sure if he was making a difference." Carson looked down at the card one more time. "Tonight, you've reminded all of us that we matter to each other. That what we do, even the smallest acts of kindness, ripple out in ways we may never know." He folded the card carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. "This card is going home with me tonight. It's going in a special place where I can see it every day, because Margaret taught me the most important lesson of my career. We're all in this together." The silence in the studio was profound. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. Then another. Then the entire audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever. Doc's orchestra joined in with a full, triumphant arrangement. Ed McMahon wiped tears from his eyes. Camera operators, boom mic technicians, and production assistants all stood and applauded. But Carson stood quietly, humbly, holding that precious piece of paper that had traveled 25 years to find him exactly when he needed it most. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. When the show ended that night, Carson didn't immediately leave the studio as was his custom. He sat alone at his desk for several minutes, rereading Margaret's note under the dimming studio lights. A production assistant later said she'd never seen Mr. Carson so moved by anything in all her years working on the show. The usually bustling post-show cleanup happened in respectful whispers. Carson kept his promise. Margaret's note went into a frame on his desk at home, where it remained until his death in 2005. According to his family, he would often look at it before big shows, especially during difficult periods in his life. The impact of that night extended far beyond the studio. NBC received thousands of letters from viewers sharing their own stories of how laughter had saved them during dark times. The network created a special segment called Thank You Notes that ran occasionally over Carson's remaining years, featuring messages from viewers whose lives had been touched by the show. But perhaps most importantly, that night changed how Carson viewed his role as an entertainer. He'd always been professional, always committed to the craft of comedy. But Margaret's note reminded him that behind every laugh was a human being who might desperately need that moment of joy. Young television hosts and comedians today still study that night, not for the technical aspects of broadcasting, but for the lesson in human connection. Carson showed them that sometimes the most powerful moments on television happen when you abandon the script and speak from the heart. Margaret's card became a symbol of television's power to heal, to connect, and to remind us of our shared humanity. It proved that entertainment at its best isn't just about making people laugh, it's about making them feel less alone in the world. And somewhere out there, Margaret's family still tells the story of how their mother's simple thank you note, written in grief and gratitude in 1962, created one of the most beautiful moments in television history 25 years later. That night, Johnny Carson didn't just read a cue card. He read a love letter from America back to itself, reminding us all that kindness matters, laughter heals, and we're never as alone as we think we are. Years later, when Carson was asked about his most memorable moments hosting The Tonight Show, he would always mention Margaret's card. People remember the big celebrity interviews, he would say in rare interviews after his retirement. They remember the funny moments, the viral sketches. But I remember Margaret. I remember the night I realized that what we were doing mattered in ways I never imagined. Carson's longtime producer, Fred de Cordova, later revealed that the discovery of Margaret's card was completely unplanned. Someone in the cue card department had been cleaning out old files and accidentally mixed some vintage cards from the early years with that night's fresh batch. It was pure chance, or maybe something more than chance. The card itself had an interesting history. After the show aired, NBC's research department tried to track down Margaret to invite her as a guest. They discovered that Margaret Thompson had passed away in 1985, just 2 years before Carson found her note. Her daughter, Susan, had written to the show after her mother's death, explaining how The Tonight Show had been her mother's favorite program right up until the end. Mom would record every episode, Susan had written to NBC. Even when she was in the hospital, she insisted on watching Johnny. She said he felt like family, like he was talking directly to her. She never got over the fact that she'd written to him once as a young woman, and he'd somehow responded on air, even though she knew he'd never actually read her letter. But he had read it. 25 years late, but he had read it. Carson kept Margaret's card until his final show in 1992. In his farewell monologue, he briefly mentioned a letter from a friend named Margaret as one of the reasons he'd loved hosting the show. Most viewers didn't understand the reference, but those who remembered that magical night in 1987 knew exactly what he meant. The tradition of reading viewer mail on television shows can be traced directly back to that moment. Late-night hosts from David Letterman to Jimmy Fallon have all cited Carson's spontaneous decision to share Margaret's note as inspiration for their own segments featuring audience letters and messages. Television historians consider that night to be one of the medium's purest moments, when entertainment transcended its boundaries and became something deeper. It proved that television could be intimate, could be healing, could be profoundly human even in front of millions of strangers. The message that stopped television became the message that started 1,000 conversations about the power of human connection. And it all began with one person brave enough to say thank you to a stranger who made them laugh when they needed it most. In the basement of the NBC archives, there's a special collection called The Carson Files. Among the thousands of photographs, scripts, and memorabilia, Margaret's original cue card sits in a climate-controlled case. Visitors to the archive often ask to see it, this simple piece of paper that reminded America that behind every laugh, every joke, every moment of levity, there's someone who might desperately need exactly that. If this story moved you the way it moved that studio audience, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they matter. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of human kindness, and leave a comment telling us about a time when laughter saved your day. Because in the end, we're all just trying to make each other laugh and feel a little less alone in this world. Margaret knew that in 1962. Johnny Carson learned it in 1987. And tonight maybe we can remember it too,